On a late autumn night in New York City, when the first cold winds of the season crept through the narrow alleys of the historic metropolis, Mount Sinai Hospital, one of the oldest hospitals in the city, remained lit like a beacon in the darkness. The noisy hustle and bustle of daytime traffic had given way to the quiet of the late night, leaving only the rustling of fallen leaves on the empty streets. In the stark white hallways of the hospital, fluorescent lights cast long reflections on the polished tile floors. The distinct smell of antiseptic mingled with the bitter aroma of coffee from the nurses' station, where a few nurses whispered to each other to stave off sleepiness. The steady hum of machines echoed from the patient rooms, like the heartbeat of a giant, reminding everyone that the battle between life and death never ceased. At that moment, through the automatic glass doors of the hospital, a strange figure appeared. It was a golden retriever, a breed commonly seen on American streets. But there was something extraordinary about this one. New Yorkers often referred to such dogs as golden retrievers, or simply Goldens, a breed deeply intertwined with American life for generations. This dog, later known as Duke, didn't seem lost or fearful like a typical stray. His golden fur, though dusty and damp from the night's dew, still radiated a peculiar beauty under the artificial lights. Duke's deep brown eyes shone with an uncommon wisdom, as if he carried a sacred mission within him. The way Duke moved was even more remarkable. His steps were light yet deliberate. Without hesitation or uncertainty, he navigated the long hallways as if he knew the way, occasionally pausing to avoid busy medical staff rushing about their duties. The nurses, exhausted after hours of intense work, barely glanced at Duke with indifference. In their minds, he was likely just another therapy dog, a method that had become increasingly popular in major New York hospitals. Duke continued his journey, passing through patient rooms where the steady breathing of patients blended with the lifeless hum of machines. Finally, he stopped in front of the most heavily guarded area, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, NICU, where tiny lives fought every second for the right to survive. In the stillness of the night, it seemed as if an invisible thread was pulling Duke toward the faint cries behind the door. Inside the NICU, a tiny infant lay in an incubator, surrounded by wires and complex machines. The steady beep of the heart monitor counted each fragile moment of life. The baby, only a few days old, had pale skin under the glow of the incubator lights, tiny fingers clenched as if clinging to life. The air in the NICU was always maintained at a stable temperature. But tonight, something felt different in the sterile space. Duke, with the keen instincts of a dog, stood motionless in front of the door, his ears perked, his body tense as if listening to a sound beyond human perception. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The blue and red lights from the monitors reflected off Duke's golden fur, creating an ethereal scene. With a gentle nudge, he pushed the door open with his nose and slipped inside without a sound. Duke approached the incubator where the baby lay. His steps were as light as a cloud, as if afraid to disturb the fragile slumber of the tiny life. Duke's gaze softened as he looked into the incubator, as if he understood the pain and loneliness of the infant. Without hesitation, Duke lay down beside the incubator. His posture exuded protection and care. The warmth from his body radiated in the cold, sterile room. And then, something miraculous began to happen. The numbers on the monitor started to change. The baby's heart rate gradually stabilized, as if comforted by the presence of this new friend. A strange phenomenon unfolded in the NICU of Mount Sinai Hospital. The nurses, focused on other patients, were unaware that in the quiet corner of the room, a miracle was silently taking place. The numbers on the monitor, which had been fluctuating alarmingly, began to stabilize inexplicably. The soft glow of the night lights cast gentle shadows, creating an almost magical atmosphere. In that light, the baby's breathing became more regular. The pale skin gradually took on a healthy pink hue. Duke remained there, his deep brown eyes never leaving the incubator, as if transmitting an invisible energy to the tiny life. The vital signs on the electronic monitor continued to improve. The baby's body temperature, which had been unstable, returned to normal. The breathing, once labored and irregular, became smooth and steady. Each breath seemed like a declaration of life's resilience. In the stillness of the night, only the hum of the machines and Duke's gentle breathing intertwined. It was as if an invisible bond connected the dog and the baby. A relationship that defied scientific explanation. Duke lay patiently, like a silent guardian protecting the baby's fragile sleep. Time passed. Dawn began to break through the window, bringing the first rays of a new day. And with that dawn, a new hope emerged in the NICU of Mount Sinai Hospital. Nurse Emily Carter stood frozen at the sight before her. Painful memories from the past flooded her mind. 20 years of experience in nursing hadn't prepared her for what she was witnessing. The hospital lights reflected off her graying hair, and the deep worry lines on her weathered face became more pronounced. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the monitor charts. There was no mistaking it, the numbers had improved significantly. Emily looked at Duke, who still lay silently beside the incubator, his eyes reflecting a profound understanding. In that moment, memories of her own son came rushing back. The long, agonizing days 15 years ago when she had sat by his incubator, clutching his tiny hand in despair. The silence of the NICU was broken only by the hum of machines and the baby's gentle breathing. Emily stood there, torn between her duties as a nurse and the call of her heart. Hospital regulations were strict about hygiene and safety, but something in Duke's eyes made it impossible for her to send him away. She slowly approached Duke, kneeling beside him. Her calloused hand gently stroked his golden fur. "You understand this pain, don't you?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Duke tilted his head slightly, as if listening and understanding. A decision was made in silence. Emily stood up, quietly pulled a thin blanket from a nearby cabinet, and placed it beside Duke. Sometimes, she told herself, love and compassion matter more than rigid rules. In the days that followed, a new routine formed in the NICU of Mount Sinai Hospital. Duke became an indispensable part of the unit. His presence brought an unusual warmth to the cold, sterile environment. Nurse Carter, with her deeply lined face, discreetly arranged for Duke to stay without drawing attention. Every morning, before the doctors arrived for rounds, she brought Duke a bowl of leftover rice and scraps from the hospital cafeteria. The dog ate calmly, as if understanding the need for silence in this quiet space. The other nurses gradually noticed the miracle unfolding. Whenever Duke left the room to eat or rest, the baby's vitals would fluctuate. But as soon as he returned, everything stabilized as if by magic. They began to whisper about this four-legged guardian. Stories spread from one shift to another under the soft glow of the hospital lights. Duke remained patient, lying beside the incubator, his deep brown eyes never leaving the baby. Some nights, when the entire hospital was asleep, Emily would see Duke lift his head at the slightest movement from the baby, like a mother watching over her child. But not everyone viewed Duke's presence positively. Skeptical glances and murmurs about violating hospital regulations grew louder. A storm was brewing, and Emily knew they would have to face it sooner or later. Dr. Richard Bennett entered the NICU with a stern expression. His eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses burned with unconcealed anger. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair, his face gaunt after 30 years of dedication to medicine. The deep wrinkles on his forehead became more pronounced as he frowned at Duke lying beside the incubator. "What is this?" His voice boomed in the quiet room, startling the nurses. "Who allowed a stray dog into a sterile area?" His fingers trembled with anger as he pointed at Duke. Nurse Carter, who was checking the baby's vitals, felt her heart race. In her 20 years of experience, she had never seen Dr. Bennett this angry. "Doctor," she tried to remain calm, "we've been monitoring the baby, and his vitals have shown significant improvement since." "Nonsense," he interrupted. "This is a hospital, not a dog shelter. We have protocols, sterile standards. How can a stray dog be allowed in the NICU?" In the corner of the room, Duke remained silent, his eyes never leaving the baby in the incubator. The monitors still displayed stable numbers, a silent rebuttal to the director's anger. Dr. Bennett stepped closer to the monitor, studying the data with a skeptical gaze. But even with his decades of experience, he couldn't deny the clear improvement in the baby's condition. However, his faith in modern medicine and strict protocols, ingrained after 30 years of practice, held firm. "If this dog isn't removed immediately," he said slowly, emphasizing each word, "I will have no choice but to take drastic measures." The next morning dawned with a heavy atmosphere in the NICU. The early morning dew clung to the windows, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Nurse Carter entered the room with a heavy heart, the lines on her aged face deeper after a sleepless night. Duke still lay there, beside the incubator, seemingly unaware of his impending fate. His deep brown eyes remained fixed on the baby, as if trying to transmit one last surge of energy before leaving. Emily approached, kneeling beside Duke. Her calloused hand gently stroked his golden fur. "You've done so well," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "But it's time to say goodbye." As if understanding her words, Duke tilted his head, his eyes reflecting a profound understanding that words couldn't convey. In that moment, Emily felt she was in the presence of a being with intelligence and a soul far beyond that of an ordinary animal. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway, signaling the arrival of security. Two large men in dark blue uniforms entered the room, their faces expressionless. "We have orders to remove the dog," one of them said in a deep, cold voice. Emily stood up, trying to remain calm despite the ache in her heart. She looked at Duke one last time and nodded to the security guards. Duke slowly stood up, offering no resistance. He walked calmly, as if understanding that his mission was complete. But before leaving, he paused, turning to look at the incubator one final time. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Duke's eyes held a deep emotion, a silent promise that no matter what, he would always protect the tiny life inside. After Duke was taken away, the atmosphere in the NICU grew heavier than ever. The hum of the machines remained steady, but something vital seemed missing. Nurse Carter tried to focus on her work, but her eyes kept drifting to the incubator where the baby lay. At first, everything seemed stable, the numbers on the monitor within normal limits. But Emily, with her years of experience, sensed a subtle change in the air. She began documenting every detail, monitoring even the smallest fluctuations. As dusk fell, the New York sky turned a soft purple. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the hospital windows. At that moment, the monitor began emitting irregular beeps. Emily rushed over, her heart pounding. The numbers were fluctuating wildly. The baby's heart rate became erratic. "Call Dr. Bennett," she shouted, her voice trembling with panic. The other nurses scrambled, their hurried footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Dr. Bennett appeared moments later, his face tense as he examined the numbers. "What's the baby's status?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "The vitals are dropping rapidly, Doctor," Emily replied, trying to stay calm. "We need to do something immediately." Dr. Bennett paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on the monitor. In that moment, the wrinkles on his face seemed deeper. And for the first time, Emily noticed the exhaustion and worry in the old doctor's eyes. "Prepare the emergency room," he finally said in a low voice. "We have no other choice." As the medical team began moving the baby, Emily couldn't help but think of Duke. She wondered if the dog was out there somewhere, still guarding and protecting the baby from afar. And in that moment, she wished she had had the courage to stand up for Duke, to hold on to the last glimmer of hope for this tiny life. The night grew late, but the lights of Mount Sinai Hospital remained bright. Nurse Carter couldn't sit still, her heart racing as she thought of the baby's critical condition. With no other choice, she decided to act. With fierce determination, she left the nurse's station, walking quickly through the empty hallways. The sound of her shoes echoed in the silent space like the frantic beating of her anxious heart. She stopped at the security desk, taking a deep breath to gather courage. "Mike," she called the night guard. "Have you seen the golden retriever anywhere?" Mike, a middle-aged man with a kind face, looked up from his book. "Emily, that dog's been outside the gate since he was removed. He won't leave, just sits there staring at the hospital." Emily's heart clenched. She hurried outside, scanning the darkness, and then, under the dim streetlight, she saw a familiar figure. Duke sat there, soaked from the night rain, but his eyes still fixed on the hospital. When he saw Emily, he stood up, wagging his tail slightly as if in greeting. "Duke," she whispered, her voice choked, "we need you. The baby needs you." Without another word, Duke followed Emily, as if he had been waiting for this moment. They slipped past the security gate, with Mike's silent assistance, as if he understood this was the right thing to do. As they approached the emergency room, the sound of machines and the urgent voices of doctors echoed out. Emily paused, looking around nervously. If caught, she could lose her job. But thinking of the baby's life, she knew she had no other choice. "Come on, Duke," she whispered. "Do what you need to do." Duke quietly entered the room. Like a silent shadow, Emily stood outside, her heart pounding, hoping the miracle would happen once more. In that moment, she felt she wasn't just a nurse but someone praying for a life. For a miracle that science couldn't explain. When Duke entered the emergency room, the air seemed to freeze. The doctors and nurses, focused on saving the baby, suddenly paused when they saw the dog. Dr. Bennett, bent over the incubator, looked up in shock and anger. "What is this?" he snapped. But his voice was drowned out by a sudden beep from the monitor. All eyes turned to the screen. The numbers, which had been fluctuating wildly, began to stabilize miraculously. The baby's heart rate, once weak and irregular, grew stronger and steadier. Duke paid no attention to the stares. Calmly approaching the incubator, he gently placed a paw on the edge of the bed, his deep brown eyes never leaving the baby. In that moment, it seemed as if an invisible energy flowed between the dog and the child. Dr. Bennett, with decades of experience, had never witnessed anything like this. He stood still, his eyes shifting from the monitor to Duke and back to the baby. The wrinkles on his forehead relaxed, replaced by a look of astonishment and something resembling belief. The moments passed in silence, broken only by the steady hum of the machines. And then, the unexpected happened. The baby, who had been motionless for days, began to stir slightly. Tiny fingers opened and closed, as if seeking contact. Nurse Carter, standing at the door with her heart racing, couldn't hold back a gasp. She looked at Dr. Bennett, waiting for his reaction. The old doctor was silent for a long moment, his eyes reflecting an internal struggle. Finally, he nodded slightly, a small gesture that carried immense weight. "Let him stay," he said in a low voice. "Perhaps there are things in medicine we don't yet understand." In that moment, everyone in the room felt they were witnessing a miracle, a connection between two lives that transcended human understanding. And in Duke's eyes, there seemed to be a glimmer of hope, of unconditional love for the tiny life fighting to survive. News of the miraculous event in the emergency room spread quickly throughout Mount Sinai Hospital. From young nurses to seasoned doctors, everyone talked about Duke and his mysterious bond with the baby. In the days that followed, a new sense of hope filled the NICU. Dr. Bennett, known for his strict demeanor and adherence to rules, seemed softer. He often visited the room, sometimes just to observe Duke in silence. The wrinkles on his face seemed less pronounced, and in his eyes, there was a newfound curiosity, a belief in things beyond the limits of science. "Perhaps we need to expand our definition of medicine," he said to Nurse Carter one day, his voice thoughtful. "There are connections, energies we can't measure with machines." Emily nodded, feeling a surge of joy and pride. She remembered her risky decision to bring Duke back, and now she knew it had been the right thing to do. The baby, named Grace, continued to show remarkable progress. Each day, her weight increased, her skin grew rosier, and her big round eyes began to open, curiously taking in the world around her. Duke remained by her side, a silent guardian. The doctors and nurses began to note a phenomenon. Whenever Duke placed his paw on the edge of the bed, Grace's heart rate became steadier, as if synchronized with the dog's heartbeat. They began to study this phenomenon, hoping to uncover a new treatment for difficult cases. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, Grace unexpectedly grasped Emily's finger. Her big round eyes looked straight into Emily's, and for the first time, a small smile appeared on her tiny face. Emily felt tears welling up, and when she turned to look at Duke, she saw his deep brown eyes also shining with profound joy. In that moment, Emily realized they were witnessing not just the recovery of a baby but the beginning of a story about love, faith, and the power of invisible connections between living beings. 2 weeks later, the warm sunlight of a spring morning in New York filled the halls of Mount Sinai Hospital. Today was a significant day, the day Grace was being discharged. The atmosphere in the NICU was filled with joy and a touch of bittersweetness. Grace's parents arrived early, their faces radiant with happiness. They held their tiny daughter tightly, tears of joy streaming down their cheeks. Dr. Bennett, with a rare smile on his aged face, handed them the discharge papers. "You've witnessed a miracle," he said warmly. Cherish every moment with your daughter. Nurse Carter stood nearby, overwhelmed with emotion as she watched Grace in her parents' arms. She remembered the early days when this tiny life had hung by a thread. And now Grace was a healthy baby, her big round eyes shining with the joy of life. But there was one indispensable character in this miraculous story, Duke. The loyal four-legged friend, who sat silently beside the incubator where Grace had once lain, his deep brown eyes following every movement of the baby, as if memorizing every detail. Grace's mother knelt beside Duke, gently stroking his golden fur. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. We will never forget what you've done. In that moment, it seemed Duke understood. He tilted his head, pressing his cheek against her hand as if offering comfort and farewell. As Grace's family walked out of the hospital doors, Duke stood still, his eyes following them until they disappeared from sight. Then, as if his mission was complete, he turned and began to walk away. Nurse Carter, her heart aching, wanted to call him back, but something in the dog's demeanor stopped her. Duke wasn't an ordinary pet, he was a free spirit, a guardian angel who came and went as he pleased. As Duke's figure faded into the morning sunlight, Emily knew this story would be told and retold in Mount Sinai Hospital, a story of unconditional love, the power of faith, and the miracles that can happen when we open our hearts to the wonders of life. And somewhere, on the streets of New York, a golden retriever continued his journey, ready for the next miracle he would bring to this world.